I've been a night shift nurse for over 15 years, and while most people assume the hardest part of my job is keeping patients alive through the night, there's another side of working the graveyard shift that few people talk about. I've never been one to believe in ghosts until I started working at St. Mary's Hospital. St. Mary's is an old, sprawling building, originally built in the late 1800s. Parts of it have been renovated, but the oldest wing still stands, mostly unused except for a few storage rooms and maintenance areas. I didn't think much of it at first. The flickering lights and creaky floors just seemed like symptoms of an old building. But the more I worked there, the more I began to notice things that didn't make sense. One of my first experiences happened about 6 months into my time at the hospital. It was around 3 a.m., the dreaded witching hour, and I was doing my rounds on the 4th floor. Most of the patients were asleep and the halls were quiet, save for the occasional beep of a heart monitor. I passed by one of the patient rooms and noticed the door slightly ajar. Inside, an elderly woman sat on the edge of her bed, her back to me. I thought it was odd. She wasn't one of my patients, but I'd seen her before, wandering the halls in her hospital gown. We had a few dementia patients, and I assumed she was one of them. As I approached to help her back to bed, she stood up and walked toward the window. I called out softly, "Ma'am, you shouldn't be out of bed, let me help you." But she didn't respond. When I reached the room, she was gone. The window was locked and there was no sign of anyone inside. I checked the patient chart outside the room. No one had been assigned to that room for days. My skin crawled, but I shrugged it off. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was a trick of the light. That's what I told myself anyway. But the experiences didn't stop there. A few months later, I was working the same shift in a different wing of the hospital. We had just admitted a new patient, an elderly man with severe heart issues. He was quiet, reserved, and didn't have many visitors. One night I checked on him and he asked me a strange question. "Who's that little girl standing in the corner?" I froze. There was no little girl in the room. There shouldn't have been anyone but the patient and me. I turned and saw nothing but shadows. I gently reassured him that no one else was there, and he smiled weakly before drifting off to sleep. 2 days later, that man passed away in his sleep. When the time came to clean out his room, one of the nurses mentioned that several patients who had stayed in that room had spoken about seeing a little girl. Some even claimed she spoke to them, though no one could ever recall what she said. That night, I avoided that room like the plague. The last experience I'll tell you about still gives me chills. It was a particularly quiet night. Around 2 a.m., the power in the hospital flickered. This wasn't uncommon during storms, but the weather had been calm. As I walked past the nurse's station, I noticed something strange. A light was on in the operating room. The OR hadn't been in use for hours, and the doors were locked, as they always were after surgeries. I walked down the hall to check, thinking maybe someone had forgotten to turn the lights off. But when I got there, the doors were wide open. Inside, the room was cold, unnaturally cold for a summer night. Surgical instruments were laid out as though a procedure was about to begin, but the room had been cleaned earlier. I stepped in, hesitating, and as I reached for the light switch, I heard a soft voice behind me. "Are you ready?" it whispered. I spun around, but no one was there. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed out of the room, shutting the doors behind me. When I told my colleagues about it, one of the older nurses just nodded knowingly and said, "It happens sometimes. The old surgeons used to stay late." These days, I try not to think too much about what I've seen and heard at St. Mary's. Maybe it's just my mind playing tricks on me during those long, lonely hours. Or maybe the hospital holds on to the spirits of those who pass through its doors, nurses, doctors, and patients alike. Either way, I've learned one thing. Hospitals are never truly empty, even when the halls seem quiet. I had never been in a hospital before, not for anything serious at least. A sprained ankle here, a checkup there, but nothing like what happened last year. I had been dealing with some nagging stomach pains for weeks, and after a series of tests, my doctor decided to admit me to St. George's Hospital for a few nights for observation. I wasn't too worried at first. It was just supposed to be routine. But what happened over those next few nights shook me to my core. It started on the second night. I was in room 312, a small, dimly lit room at the end of a long hallway. The hospital wasn't particularly old, but something about it felt off. The silence at night was different than normal silence, like the building itself was holding its breath. That night, I woke up around 2 a.m., feeling restless. The room was dark, except for the faint glow of the hallway light coming through the cracked door. As I lay there, I heard the soft sound of footsteps outside my door. It wasn't unusual for nurses to walk the halls at night, but this sounded different. Slow, deliberate, almost dragging. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited, expecting a nurse to come in and check on me, but no one entered. After a minute, I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" No response. I figured maybe they were just checking charts or something, so I tried to ignore it and go back to sleep. The next night was worse. I had fallen asleep early, exhausted from a day of tests and questions. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again, but this time something was different. I felt watched. The air was heavy, thick with something I couldn't explain. I opened my eyes and saw something, or rather, someone, standing at the foot of my bed. It was a woman. She was pale, with long dark hair hanging in front of her face, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. At first I thought it was a nurse, but something was off. Her gown was old, torn, and stained. She didn't move, didn't speak. She just stood there, staring at me with eyes that seemed hollow and dark. I couldn't move. It was like my body was frozen. My heart was racing, but my limbs wouldn't respond. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The woman slowly raised her arm, pointing toward the window. My eyes followed her finger, and when I looked back, she was gone. The next morning, I told the nurse about what I had seen, half expecting her to laugh it off or tell me it was just a dream. But she didn't. She gave me a strange look, almost like she knew something she wasn't saying. "You're not the first patient to see things like that," she said quietly, "especially in that room." That's when I found out about the history of room 312. Years ago, a woman had died in that very room. She had been a long-term patient, admitted for some kind of rare illness. She wasn't supposed to die, not so suddenly, but something went wrong. The story goes that she had been calling for help in the middle of the night, but no one came. When the nurses finally found her in the morning, she sadly passed. Since then, patients in room 312 had reported strange things: voices, footsteps, and sightings of a woman matching her description. On my final night in the hospital, I tried to stay awake, determined not to experience whatever haunted that room again. But at some point, exhaustion overtook me, and I drifted off. I woke up around 3 a.m. to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought it was the TV, but the room was pitch dark, and the TV was off. The whispers were soft, urgent, but I couldn't make out the words. They seemed to come from all around me, like the walls themselves were speaking. Suddenly, the door to my room creaked open, even though I knew I had shut it tightly before going to bed. My eyes darted to the door, and there, in the dim hallway light, I saw her again. The same woman, standing just outside the door, watching me. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her were shadows, figures, shifting in the dark, just out of sight. They seemed to be moving closer, inching toward the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, my body frozen in fear. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it was just a nightmare, but when I opened them again, she was still there. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear, but eventually, the room grew quiet. The shadows disappeared, and the woman was gone. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, my eyes glued to the door, waiting for something, anything, to happen again. The next morning, I was discharged. I never told my family about what I experienced. I didn't want them to think I was crazy, but I know what I saw. I know what I felt. Even now, months later, I still have nightmares about that room. Sometimes, in the quiet of the night, I swear I can still hear the whispering, the footsteps, and I wonder if I'll ever truly leave room 312 behind.